and welcome to Fintech Insider Focus. I'm Benjamin Ensor, Director of Research and Strategy here at 11FS. In this series, in collaboration with Visa, we are going to shine a light on fintech in different parts of the world. In the first part of this season, we're going to be honing in on the Middle East's booming financial sector and speak to people right at the heart of it. In this episode, we're discussing the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, looking specifically at creating financial hubs in the region and the roles that the Dubai International Financial Centre, DIFC, and Abu Dhabi Global Market, ADGM, are playing in the country and the wider region, and how they are helping the growth of fintech. We also want to look at technology developments, allowing for alternative finance, digital assets, and artificial intelligence in the region. So to discuss these topics and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a mighty panel of industry experts. So firstly, a big hello to my co-host, Hassan Kazmi, Head of Digital Partnerships for Central Europe, the Middle East and Africa at Visa. How are you, Hassan?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very, very well. It's really good to be partnering with you for this. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you do in your role, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I cover digital partnerships across the CEMEA region, which, like you mentioned, is a number of countries. So it's over 85 countries. And digital partnerships for us means all fintechs and also all of our technology accounts. So the likes of the Samsungs, Apples, Googles of the world is managed by my team. And any fintech could be a brand new startup with 2 people on the ground to, some of the much, much bigger names that are working across our regions. So all of that falls under my team's remit. And our responsibility is to make sure we partner with them, provide them support as they grow, as they expand within the region. And especially on the fintech side, now we're seeing a lot of fintechs that are looking to go outside of CEMEA and into some of the other regions of the world. So that's what our team is designed to support.
That's a vast number of potential partners. So I'm delighted to hear that you have a team.
Yes,
I hope it's a big team because there's a lot of.
It can always be bigger.
Okay. We're also delighted to welcome Nick Philpott, who is the co-founder and head of partnerships at Zodia Markets by Standard Chartered and OSL. It's great to have you here, Nick. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your background, please?
So I have been in financial services for 16 years. Started out at Standard Chartered as a graduate back in 2006. And I've worked across a number of different regions. So Standard Chartered, for those of you who are not aware of it, it's a 170-year-old British bank based in the UK, but specializes in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So during the course of my career, I've spent time in Dubai. I lived there for 6 months, working in DIFC specifically. Nigeria, I spent a year there working on the sales trading desk, and then 2 years in Singapore. And that's also fairly standard for Standard Chartered. Zodia Markets is an OTC match principal brokerage, offering execution services in digital assets against fiat currencies.
And OTC is over the counter, obviously. And finally, we are delighted to welcome back Anissa Zaman, CEO and founder of Anissa Finance and a fintech comms specialist. Welcome back. Can you remind our listeners what you do and what Anissa Finance does, please?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Benjamin. So essentially, Anissa Finance is the foundational financial literacy for women specifically interested in Islamic finance. This has been honed in from sort of my expertise in fintech for the last decade, having worked with everyone from Wahid to Algebra to Zoya Finance, as well as larger NGOs like the UN Women. So we're really here to facilitate and increase the financial literacy landscape for women, holistically speaking. And to date, we've helped over 10,000 women.
Fantastic. Okay, well, before we dive in, just a quick reminder to you, our listeners, that the views or opinions of our panel are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the companies they are representing. And as always, nothing we say should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please do your own research. Okay, let's dive straight in. Hassan, can we start with you by telling us a little bit about how Visa is involved in the UAE and why you think this is a country and a wider region that deserves more attention?
Yeah, so that's I could take up the whole 45 minutes talking about that. But the short answer is, if you look at the UAE and the region, And if you compare it to what's happening around the world, arguably this is the fastest growing region in the world for many things, including financial services and fintech. And then if you look a level deeper, the question is, why is that the case? And there are many reasons for it. So if you look at the demographics of this region, there are very few other parts of the world that have as attractive of a demographic that we have in this region. The second is the stability and the regulatory framework that this region provides, right? The regulators have been extremely progressive in terms of thinking about the next generation of financial services, and fintech is a critical part of the next generation of financial services. So everything from the creation of ADGM to DIFC, it was designed with the specific purposes of making it easy to do business. And we have very few regions in the world that look at making business easy, especially for startups and newer entrants into the market. So when you combine the stability in the region, the regulatory framework in the region, the immense talent pool we have in the region, the demographic from a customer point of view in the region, all four of those factors combine to make the UAE a very attractive destination to set up a new fintech, but more importantly, not only set up a new fintech, but use it as a springboard to then expand into the region. And like I mentioned, for us in Visa, CEMEA is broad. So it's all of the GCC countries, it's Pakistan, it's North Africa and Eastern Europe. And even though that's a Visa construct, more and more we are seeing that a lot of our clients also are thinking of the UAE as a hub to expand into Africa, to expand into places like Pakistan, also Eastern Europe. So through a combination of all these factors, it makes the UAE a very attractive destination to set up and then expand regionally, but more and more also globally. We're starting to have conversations where clients are saying, we're doing great in the UAE, we've expanded in the region. Help us understand if we want to take it beyond this region, what do we need to do to make that happen?
Thank you. Nick, you mentioned that you'd worked in the Dubai International Financial Centre, and as I understand it, Zodia Markets is moving to the UAE imminently. So, what are the benefits for you of moving to or operating in the UAE?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're not moving the entire business, just to clarify that. So we're going to continue to have our UK and Irish presences. What we're going to do is we're going to open an office in Abu Dhabi Global Markets. And the objective there, first and foremost, is to have an entity that can actually get a license. As I'm sure many of your listeners are already familiar with, there are very few regulations for crypto assets at the moment. A lot of regulators are still in the process of drafting or consulting regulation. ADGM was one of the leaders in this area. So they've had a licensing regime for some time. And they've actually licensed a number of different companies. So we started speaking to them in 2021, so towards the end of 2021. And the fact that they have an English legal system, I think is very, very helpful, because it means that we can effectively use the same practices and same approaches as we use in the UK. So it makes setting up the business very, very simple, or replicating the business in a way. And for us, we see it as being very much an Africa and Middle East hub. And as I said, I've spent time in Africa as well, so it just seems very logical for us to make the move. As it happens, I'm literally flying tonight to go and set up. So I'm on the 8:55.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us, and good timing too. Anissa, what's your perspective on this? How important in an age of digital, how important is that sort of physical presence? Is it important to have a sort of cluster in a physical place?
Great question. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. I think as we look forward, it's become increasingly more important, particularly when we consider the pandemic. And when we look at the idea of community building and what that looks like, the evolution of community building more specifically in the UAE has sort of really gone from strength to strength. So when we're thinking about things like meeting, collaborating, creating, all of this ultimately spurs innovation. And helps to add value no matter where you are in the world. I think something else to add as well is the fact that the UAE was founded just over 50 years ago. So ecosystems are still being built, and whether it's government institutions or ADGM and DIFC, etc., it's all about spurring the idea of community and fostering identity and building those ecosystems.
Hassan, how important is the role of government and governments in this? Because in the previous episode on Saudi Arabia, we talked about the sort of importance of government-led initiatives like Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which is obviously a single government top-down initiative. By contrast, in the UAE, you sort of have a level of competition between sort of Dubai and Abu Dhabi and so on. Does that help to accelerate fintech, or does it actually kind of make it harder because you've got these slightly competing regimes?
So that's a great question. The short answer is I think it makes it more competitive and interesting. And the reason for that is because the market is growing so fast that it's not you have to pick one or the other. And it would be an issue if the market was small, if it wasn't growing. But given the pace of growth that we have, I don't think it's a negative in any manner. Plus, the other thing is there's coordination between the two. Right. So it's not as if the regulation in one is very different than the other. It's very similar. And the ecosystem is going so quickly and the potential is so high, then you could very reasonably expect both of them to do really well. And then it's a matter of a personal choice for various reasons. One fintech might set up somewhere else. One fintech might set up in the sister city. But we are seeing that there's more than enough demand coming through that we can very easily manage. Or rather, DIFC and ADGM have enough inbound coming in that it's not an issue.
I think just one thing I'd add there as well is the ability to execute. So having good and well put together regulations is one thing, but actually being able to take someone through that licensing process and having the resources to deploy to do that, I think is critical. I think there have been some regulators in other parts of the world, this is very, very public knowledge, where I think that's been something of a challenge. And certainly our experience with the FSRA, they've been in ADGM. They've been super responsive and a very willing and very engaging partner.
If I can just add to that, I think the last point that Nick mentioned was the engagement with both the regulators, right? And I think I've worked in the US for a number of years in banking and then also spent time in Europe. And the unique thing about regulators in this region is they're very open to feedback. And to Anisa's point, since the ecosystem is being created, nobody will get it perfect the first time. And the way you perfect it is by a little bit of trial and error, getting feedback from participants like all three of us on this call. And the biggest difference I think that makes is if the regulator is willing to listen. They might not agree with everything we say, which is okay. That's it's a two-way conversation. But the fact that we have access to them, the fact that we can go to them with data, the fact that we can go to them with some of the other best practices and learnings from the other region, and they listen to us and engage with us, I think that is by far the most critical factor in making both of these regulators successful.
Anisa, do you think the sort of competition between, not the competition, the sort of the friendly competition, let's say, between sort of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but also Saudi, does that sort of benefit all of those regions? Because as Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or whatever become more attractive, it just creates more momentum in the region as a whole? Or is this a sort of nil-sum game and there's a real competition between the three of them?
I actually think, okay, when we consider the UAE, ultimately speaking, and I'm talking about regionally speaking as sort of the GCC, it is definitely a powerhouse, perhaps even considered the nuclei. And I say that because whether we're looking at Abu Dhabi or we're looking at Dubai, ultimately there's so much strength and there's so much momentum and vigor in what's happening in terms of the fintech ecosystem. It can only add to a positive trajectory for the UAE. When we look at that in comparison to, say, Saudi or even Qatar, I think there's so much momentum going on there respectively as well in their own way. But at the same time, it's sort of helping to borrow and barter between these nations that enable the GCC holistically to sort of level the playing field, so to speak. And when we look at that comparatively in where East meets West, and we're looking at sort of how, for example, the UK or the US may be developing their own fintech ecosystem, you can really see that the UAE, for example, has sort of really decided to take a look and think twice and think about how they can sort of envelope things like the regulatory bodies into their everyday system. I think there's so much growth and potential here. And because of things like, for example, Vision 2020 for the UAE, which looked at increasing government efficiency, When we look at things like We Are Vision 2031, which is the next step for the UAE, and it's looking at integrating programs and shaping the future of the country, whether that be through the economy, whether that be through tech, etc., we can really see how it's sort of coming alive. So I think just to add to that, it's not just specifically Abu Dhabi or even Dubai. When we look at Ras Al Khaimah, for example, once upon a time a sort of sleepy city, it's now about to launch their digital assets oasis. Further to that, when we look at Sharjah, which was very much the cultural capital and hub of the UAE, we look at things like the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Centre or even Sharjah Business Women's Centre as well. And so they're really helping to also include other women into the sort of ecosystem to encourage business ownership and creativity and innovation in that as well. I just want to add, because there was a recent report I read by UBS in Women and Investing more specifically. And with women's wealth, more specifically in the Middle East, they account for something like 780 billion. And that's just sort of throughout, whether that be societal or cultural norms, and really unleashing women's potential through that. But how the UAE and specifically in these Emirates, and when we look at Sharjah, for example, are hoping to envelope that in is by sort of helping encourage this idea of ownership, of innovation through business and creation ultimately.
That's a very interesting topic. We've done some work here at 11FS looking at precisely that issue of sort of women and the extent to which they want sort of more control over their finances and so on. Probably a wider topic than we've got time to go through today, but it's a fantastic topic. Nick, I want to come back to a point that you and Hasan were making about the sort of attitude of the regulators. Clearly, the regulators in Abu Dhabi, Dubai have learned from regulators elsewhere in the world, whether that's Singapore or London or New York or wherever. But are we at the point where actually they're starting to move ahead of them? They're potentially being more progressive, more practical, more open, more communicative? Or am I going too far there?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, speaking from a point of view of crypto assets, I mean, there's a lot of people who say, we can't do anything until we have some regulatory clarity. I think actually the regulators in the region have actually done, to an extent, what I would do, which is look at the existing corpus of regulations that cover traditional financial services, because there's a vast amount in there that you can draw upon and really just overlay crypto assets into the principles of those regulations. So, for example, market abuse. Don't abuse. Be abusive in terms of your activity on an exchange, for example, or best execution. Take all sufficient steps to give your counterparty the best possible outcome in terms of price, cost, speed, and so on. So there's a lot that you can read across, and I think that my personal impression is what a lot of the regulators in the region have done is to look at particularly things like MiFID II in the European Union and the UK, and have taken a lot of inspiration from that, and of course other regulations. But I see a lot of MiFID II in the crypto asset or virtual asset regulations that I've seen in both Abu Dhabi Global Markets and DIFC.
That brings me to another question. I mean, maybe Anissa, this one's best for you. This is fantastic. All these regulations are fantastic, and they're enabling the growth of all sorts of companies. They're encouraging growth of fintech and so on. But is that trickling through to the lives of the people who live in the UAE? You were talking, Anissa, about some of the different Emirates, and obviously some of those are wealthier than others. You only have to go to Dubai to see it's relatively wealthy compared with other parts of the country. Is the growth of fintech starting to have a sort of trickle down effect? Is it benefiting the people who live in the UAE yet, or is it mostly just benefiting those fintech companies?
I think when we look at fintech, from its inception, ultimately it was the idea or the very notion was to democratize finance. And so when we look at that and how it's applied to different markets, it looks slightly different, but ultimately speaking, it filters in the same way. So when we look at fintech, for example, in the format of buy now, pay later products, for example, you can see that consumption is something that's very much part and parcel of everyday Dubai life. And so whether that's being able to use something like Tabby, for example, or the equivalent in the UK being something like Klarna or ClearPay, it's very much embedded in the everyday life of the average person living in the UAE. I would say actually, and go one step further, that when we look at sort of newer technologies and sort of perhaps what one could argue is perhaps the sexier technologies of AI, Web3, and indeed crypto, I think that's something that people, generally speaking, are quite excited about here in the UAE. They're very much intrigued about it. And once again, it's the idea of democratizing finance, because it's not just about the UAE. The UAE, when we consider it as a market, is very much a global hub for people to be interacting and liaising and doing business with those perhaps in the Far East, whether that be in Africa, whether that be indeed in the US or and Europe as well. So I think these are all things to really consider. That it's not just the trickle down on a micro level, but certainly on a macro level as well.
So if I may, very quickly, I think there's a lovely point about the hub. I think it places the UAE very much as a hub in a wider network. So at the other end of the wealth spectrum, perhaps, if you have a worker, a guest worker in the UAE who's wanted to send money home to the Philippines. So, for example, today, the way that would happen, they would need to take their dirhams, they would need to convert them into dollars, and then those dollars would have to go west, and they would need to clear through the US clearing system, FedWire. They would then come back around the world probably a few days later and finally arrive in the Philippines, and you can cash out in Philippine pesos. With something like stablecoins, so there are dirham stablecoins planned, there's US dollar stablecoins. From a geographic perspective, you can go east instead of being forced to go west, which if you're trying to send money from the UAE to the Philippines, even someone who doesn't understand financial services can understand the concept of it's surely intuitively more efficient to go east than it is to have to go west and travel around the world, which is how the system works today.
Hassan, I'd love to bring you in on that point Nick's making about the UAE as a hub, not just for the Gulf region, but more widely, because you were talking earlier about sort of Pakistan and some of the other markets that you and your team work with. To what extent are you seeing the UAE becoming a hub, not just for companies focused on, the Gulf region, but for companies focused on the whole Middle East, or even, the whole of this sort of Islamic world or the entire world?
Yes, so we're seeing a lot of that, and the reason for that is, I'll again go back to the regulatory framework, because as a former banker, that I can't emphasize how important that is. And having a regulatory framework that works and is also flexible in terms of evolving as the needs evolves makes a big difference. The other thing that we touched on a little bit is actually the talent pool, which is also critical. So if I'm a new startup, and the startup world is competitive, we know that because of interest rate changes in the US and in Europe, funding is much more challenging than it was during COVID. So that actually is a critical factor in terms of making sure the fintech can survive. But beyond the funding, I would say talent is probably the most important element, arguably even more than funding, because talent is what actually gets you funding, right? So the talent in this region, especially the US, is phenomenal, because not only is it becoming a hub for banking and companies, it's becoming a hub for people. So if you're a young graduate who's graduating from any of the top universities in the world, obviously you have opportunities in places like New York and London and Hong Kong, but you also have tremendous opportunities in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. So you as a person need to make a decision as to where do I want to start off. And we can again have a separate conversation on sort of career planning and what I would advise, or what all of us would advise somebody to do. But from a talent point of view also, the region is phenomenal. And as you know, a lot of international universities have set up their sister campuses here. So not only is it talent that's coming from abroad, but now it's homegrown talent that's born and raised here, or has spent a lot of time here and now wants to work and settle here for a long period of time. So there are multiple things that have changed within the UAE and the region that are making it a lot more attractive to set up firms here and set them up for long-term sustainable growth. And you combine that with the political stability, the economic stability, the access to anywhere in the world. You can get on a plane from Abu Dhabi and Dubai and literally be in any corner of the world the same day. All of those factors actually make a very big difference when you're looking to identify where you should set up a business, especially because, going back to my earlier point, fintechs are now saying, yes, we will start off in the UAE, but we want to expand globally. So you need to have many, many different elements in place to make a country or a city or a region attractive to set up a new business. Transit, talent, financing, regulatory framework, and all of those things are present here.
I wholeheartedly endorse that. I mean, as someone literally going through that process right now, just I think don't underestimate the trivial. I've managed to open my UAE bank account. It's open. I haven't actually been to the UAE yet. I did the whole thing remotely. My visa is printed there on my desk, ready to go for tonight. I haven't had to go to an embassy or anything like that, or get documents apostilled, or some of the sort of slightly archaic behaviors that you see from other jurisdictions. It's all done. Obviously, there's a few more things to do when I get there. But the core part of it is done, and it removes a huge amount of stress just from me as a person. It's phenomenal. Very impressive.
Love it. Love that point about talent as well. Okay, well, coming up, we're going to take a closer look at how the UAE is embracing newer subsectors of the financial industry, including Web3 and Gen AI, and how that can shape and maybe strengthen the attractiveness of the UAE as a hub for the region or indeed the whole world. So we'll be back after this very quick break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Fintech Insider Focus, where we're taking a close look at the UAE's financial sector. We've looked more broadly at the economic benefits of financial hubs such as the DIFC and the ADGM, but what's actually happening in these hubs? So I'd love to maybe start by exploring how the UAE is embracing, Web3. Nick, we've already covered this a little bit, but to what extent is, the sort of development of innovation hubs and so on becoming an incentive for companies in Web3 and crypto to come to Dubai or the UAE more widely?
Well, I think to Hassan's earlier point, it's that open-mindedness. So at the moment, I think business models in crypto assets are still evolving, and there are definitely some departures from the experiences that both he and I certainly had at traditional banks. So settlement is in a T0 cadence rather than T+2. You can settle at weekends and things like that. You use custodians to look after, it's very specialized custodians to look after your digital assets. And at the moment, I don't think there is a standard approach. I think that there has been a generally accepted approach with exchanges doubling up as custodians, so the likes of Coinbase and RAK and FTX. We all sort of know how that ended. And for example, we take a very different approach where we are non-custodial. We presented that to the regulator in Abu Dhabi Global Markets, and they were very candid and open. They said, well, we've never seen this before. We didn't write our regulations with you in mind, but let's sit down, let's get a whiteboard out, do some boxes and arrows, and we can work out how to make it work. So there was definitely that willingness, I think. And it's the nature of innovation. I mean, if it was predictable, then it wouldn't really be innovation. So you need to have that flexibility. Sorry to be frivolous, but you need to have that ability to accommodate the expect the unexpected. There you go. There's a catchphrase.
What about Ras Al Khaimah? We talked about that emirate a little bit earlier, and obviously they've created the RAK Digital Assets Oasis. As I think, Inisa, you were talking about Ras Al Khaimah as well. How compelling is something like that to go to a sort of smaller emirate, starting something new? Is that something, Nick, that you're sort of going to look at closely? Is that of interest, or are your plans already sort of solidified at this point? You're on the plane tonight, so.
Well, I'm on the plane tonight, but I think also just by virtue of the fact that we're part of a large multinational banking group, as you can imagine, there are quite a lot of hoops we have to jump through in order to be able to establish a new entity, to be able to engage with the regulator, and so on and so forth. So as much as we try to move at the speed of a fintech, to an extent we do have our shoelaces tied together by the bank just to slow us down a little bit, but for good reasons. I think my main observation there is that actually a lot of the jurisdictions that were at the forefront of putting together regulations, or at least just thinking in terms of digital assets, were small jurisdictions, say Mauritius, Malta, the Cayman Islands, for example. So I think a lot of them have taken very courageous steps. I think there was a lot to learn from those initial efforts of putting together a sort of corpus of regulations. But also, given the fact that a lot of these industries, so if we're talking about Web3, we've gone from read to write to own. Web3 is very much about digital ownership. And as you can imagine, that is almost infinitely scalable. So even though you might have a small physical jurisdiction, the digital jurisdiction, if you like, or ecosystem that you can put on top of that can be infinitely larger. So I think you do have to pay close attention to the small, partly A, because they're agile, B, because they're probably a little bit more open-minded than perhaps some of the slower, larger, more traditional jurisdictions, but also because this new economy does have that infinite scalability.
Hasan, what's your view on the sort of UAE's sort of focus on Web3 and becoming a more accommodating jurisdiction than many other parts of the world have been? Obviously, we've seen a number of jurisdictions becoming borderline hostile to sort of blockchain related digital assets. What's your view on this?
I think from a regulatory point of view, it's a great step that they've taken, because the point is that when we think about the next evolution of financial services, I think we can all agree that it's going to have some elements of digital assets, right? We can spend hours debating what it will look like, but the fact is nobody quite knows. And that's the truth. But the way you get there is through experimentation and creating some sort of a regulatory sandbox or allowing fintechs to try and experiment is, in my opinion, the best way to do it, because we don't know what we don't know. And the way we will resolve that is by trying and testing it, but doing it in a way that's confined and contained. So the approach that the UAE is taking is by allowing this experimentation is, I think, exactly the right approach, because what that allows them to do is, since they're at the forefront of innovation, when we actually come up with a new type of financial instrument or a new way to settle something using blockchain or whatever that use cases look like, the UAE will be the leader in that. And that does mean you take some risk, but the right balance that I think the UAE is striking is balancing the risk with the reward. Because you do have to experiment, you have to take the risk, but you can do it in a way that's fairly contained. And striking that balance is hard, but I think the UAE has done a tremendous job in striking that right balance. And there are some other jurisdictions around the world that have also done that, Singapore being one of them. So that allows them to take a leadership position in the next generation of fintech evolution. And again, to Anisa's point, the advantage the UAE has is, since we don't have a lot of legacy infrastructure, we don't have a lot of legacy regulation, so that allows us to move much quicker than some of the other jurisdictions where they've been around for a lot longer, and that has both positive and negatives. But sometimes the legacy infrastructure from a regulatory point of view can become too much of a burden.
Yeah, there's a lot more at stake, isn't there? There's a lot more established, and I suppose you've also got maybe more people pushing back who are comfortable with the way the market is set up currently and maybe unwilling to see or reluctant to encourage competition. You never know quite how much lobbying takes place in established markets, but we know that some takes place, right? Anisa, what about artificial intelligence? Right, we talked a huge amount about artificial intelligence on this podcast. I think on every pretty much any podcast. Have you seen a lot of developments of AI in the UAE? Is that becoming an enormous growth opportunity for the country?
Yeah, certainly. I think considering the work I do and the sort of global footprint it has, I'm yet to see another market that's sort of treated AI in the way the UAE has. And, just for reference, let's say, back in 2017, the UAE were very much ahead of the curve with setting up the Ministry of AI, and that's where the Artificial Intelligence Program, which is a specialized training program, which was set up sort of in conjunction, facilitated by the University of Oxford, was set up. So the mission of that program specifically was to make the UAE the sort of number one hub, first stop shop for innovation in the field of AI and robotics. Speaking from my own experience as well, working within the AI field, both myself and with other sort of AI related startups, it's very much a hub and a place where people sort of feel like, if I could perhaps compare it to perhaps like a playground, if you will, where you're free to create in truly the way you would like to create, and with the help and support of whether that be government institutions, regulatory bodies, as sort of Nick and Hassan had both mentioned earlier, when we look at regulatory bodies, and more specifically actually sandboxes, because when we look at fintech sandboxes, what the UAE has done, and certainly what other GCC countries have also done, is look to the West, look at what they've done in terms of setting up that level of regulatory infrastructure, and then sort of build on top of that, innovate accordingly, provide that level of hand-holding. So the legal infrastructure is also there, part and parcel with these startups, so that they don't find themselves looking back retrospectively and thinking, oh gosh, I've now got to do ABC 1, 2, 3. So there's definitely a level of building and framework that's there, and that's very much a part and parcel of the infrastructure. But also there's the innovation and creativity, which enables people to really go out there, explore, expand, and innovate.
I think one other thing I can add from my experience, so I helped establish the data science and innovation team at Standard Chartered Bank. And one observation is that the gentleman who led that team, Dr. Alexei Kondratiev, now works for ADGM. So he really at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. So he relocated several years ago, and I know they've built quite a significant artificial intelligence team. So I know on the one hand, certainly there's the regulatory side, the government side, but also I think there are organizations like ADGM that have the scale and the motivation and the wherewithal to be able to do something, I was going to say in the private sector, but in the sort of quasi-public-private sector, if you like. I think that's unique to the region.
And if I can just add to that, Benjamin, but the other part about the region is if you logistically think about where Dubai is located, within a few hours flying distance, you're covering a very diverse range of markets. And AI specifically, the way you get better in Gen AI is by experimenting more, trying different things. So if you look at the type of use cases if I was a company setting up, let's say, an AI startup in this region, I would want to be able to train my models on a bunch of different use cases. And that diversity of the countries, the economic conditions, the demographics, the use cases is what I would want access to be able to build sort of the best-in-class Gen AI solution, whatever that may look like. So the unique advantage, again, that the UAE has is within a very short logistical distance, you can cover many different countries, many different economic landscapes, many different demographics, many different customers and their users and their behaviors. So that makes it quite unique. Whereas if you were setting up in other parts of the world, yes, you may have better access to funding, but in terms of the diversity of use cases that you could try or test your models on would be a little bit more limited.
And just picking up on Hassan's point about build, don't forget that there's also physical infrastructure and physical requirements behind this. So at the most trivial end, you need a phenomenal quantity of electricity. And I've observed it in Abu Dhabi, the UAE, for example. They opened a nuclear power station last year, built in record time. Certainly if you just look at the newspapers here in the UK and the challenges and the travails and the expense that they have in trying to build a nuclear power station here, it's absolutely frightening. Whereas someone like the UAE can get the planning permission, get the funding, get the workers, get the kit, get it built, and get it producing power. I mean, just that background, that ability to not have to worry about those sorts of things, I think then lets you focus on the more elaborate challenges, to Hassan's point and Anissa's point, of gathering the data and sorting out your regulations and building on the software side.
Yes. I mean, of course, the UAE is blessed with a huge amount of sort of natural assets in terms of not only oil, but also, sunshine. You just think, you could use solar energy as well as nuclear energy.
But I think solar with the UK, that's not a fair.
No, indeed. But in
the winter we've had.
But in the UAE, you could use solar.
Yes.
But you come to an interesting point there about the role of governments and to what extent it helps to have a let's say, a sort of relatively stable long-term government. I think we want to avoid getting deep into politics, but clearly there are some sort of more polarized societies where you can see almost one political party almost undoing the work of the opposite political party, and that creates, to some extent, regulatory instability. It's quite hard to plan if you don't know if the new administration is going to just sort of undo what the current administration is doing. A country like the UAE with relatively stable government, without wanting to sort of go into the merits of democracy or whatever, but with relatively stable government from a regulatory standpoint, is that an asset? It looks like an asset to me, that you have that kind of regulatory stability, that because you don't have these sort of swings in government from sort of one major political party to another, that creates more stability from a regulatory standpoint.
I'll pick it up if you like. I think it gives you the ability to really focus on undertaking major infrastructure projects. So I'm trying to draw an analogy, for example. So the undersea cable that was put in place in the 19th century under the Victorians. Here in the UK, I mean, the Victorians are sort of famous for the sheer scale of the infrastructure that they put in place. And I think they had those long-term objectives and that long-term stability in order to be able to deliver projects like that. I think if countries like the UAE have that same long-term view, then actually getting stuff done, like building a nuclear power station, building a large grid compute facility, or whatever else it might be, I think suddenly becomes possible, because you can take that slow and purposeful, not cautious, but very deliberate approach.
Just to add to what Nick had just mentioned, I think when we consider the idea of, once again, sort of like red tape, innovation, this sort of tug of war, so to speak, I think the vision, certainly sort of from my opinion, from a government institution opinion rather, is the idea that when we think about what we want the future to look like as the UAE, those sorts of thoughts are very much centralized. Everyone wants to move forward. Okay, so now what does this look like? Right, let's now segment this into the economy, technology, infrastructure. Okay, now how do we move forward? So it's very incremental in that sense. So there's very much a trickle down, but it's also about getting the job done. And once again, as it's a fairly new country, it's just over 50 years old. When it was founded just over 50 years ago. When we consider those things, it's moved leaps and bounds to create that and to compete with the likes of the US, the UK, etc. And now we can see it sort of superseding that perhaps in certain pockets as well. So I think when we consider what this looks like, how it could go, whether we're umming and ahhing about it, I think ultimately speaking, it's the centralized view that we can create and we can do better. Let's now go off and do it.
So we're running out of time. So I'd love to draw this conversation to a close by asking all three of you to just wrap up your thoughts on what the appeal for existing companies operating elsewhere in the world to either relocate to or expand into the UAE. Maybe Hasan, maybe you can share your thoughts first. What's the ultimate sort of appeal of the UAE as a market for fintechs or established financial institutions? Why operate in the UAE?
So there are many reasons, but if I were to summarize it, I would say because it makes it easy. And I don't want to overcomplicate it. They make everything so easy. To Nick's point, right? You need a visa. You don't need to go to the embassy. You can just do everything online. And I recently moved to the UAE myself from New York with my family, and everything was done in about 2 weeks' time. I don't think there's any other country where you can pack up and move with your family in about 2 weeks' time. But sort of a more detailed answer is, it comes down to, first of all, that the country has a vision to grow. The country has a vision to support businesses. We have a regulator that's very open to feedback and engagement. And that's critical because there's no way any of us can predict what the future of finance or the future of anything will look like. But what we know is that we will need to evolve. And as a new business, or even as an established business, the way you succeed is by evolving your business model. And for that, you need to be in an environment and an ecosystem that evolves with you. And that's everything from evolving regulations. It's everything from having a great talent pool. And to some of the points we discussed earlier, it's also some of the physical infrastructure that needs to evolve. So the country is growing, the regulator is evolving. And if you as a business want to be part of a growth story, which will, I think, fundamentally have a major positive impact around the world, then this is the place you need to be.
Nick, as a company moving to expanding to the UAE.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a case of it's almost having that sort of Goldilocks combination of characteristics. So the talent pool, as Hasan quite rightly cites, but I think it's number one, the geography, I think, plays to its favor. So it sits very squarely between East and West, in a sense, plus also very close to Africa, which is going to be one of the fastest growing continents, certainly in the rest of our careers. And then in terms of realizing that it's not necessarily the public sector that innovates, that its role is to create the environment where innovation can happen. And I think it's that willingness, that open-mindedness, but also critically, it's got sufficient mass for you to actually really test something at a scale, maybe not massive scale, but a scale. But it's not so small that you don't have that same sort of test bed. You can really sort of test something to destruction in the UAE, test and adjust it, discover any problems, and then you can scale it to much, much larger markets. So it's got that magic combination sort of right in the center. It's a meeting of many different sort of competing characteristics.
Thank you. And Anissa, last word to you.
I don't think there's going to be an awful lot I can add to be quite frank, because I agree with both Hasan and Nick. I think ultimately speaking, if you're someone with a true entrepreneurial spirit and you have that growth mindset, I can't quite see how any other market could really give you what the UAE could possibly give you. So once again, it's sort of like an entrepreneur's playground. It is the idea to test. It is the idea to build. It is the idea to create and innovate and also be supported in doing so as well. And I think purely from, once again, my perspective, having worked with so many different women and what they're looking to do in terms of building their own wealth and building their own businesses, certainly a market like the UAE can really help that trajectory as well.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful way to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you all so much for joining me. Where can people find out a little bit more about each of you? Hasan.
So LinkedIn would probably be the best place. So my profile is there. And then Visa hosts a number of different events. We in Dubai and around the region, we are very proudly co-sponsoring the DIFC Fintech Summit later in May. So we'll be there. A number of our partners will be there. So looking forward to connecting with folks at one of these events.
Nick?
LinkedIn, of course, but then also zodiamarkets.com. We put out quite a lot of research pieces, particularly on the meeting of crypto assets and financial history and market structure. So I think that'd be a good place.
And Anissa?
LinkedIn, if you're feeling formal. Instagram at anissa.finance if you're not. And of course, anissazaman.com as well.
And you can find me, Benjamin Ensor, on LinkedIn, and you can find out more about the work that the team is doing at 11fs.com. So thank you all very much for listening. If you like what you've heard, please follow our podcast. Do leave us a review or let us know what you'd like to hear us covering in the future. If you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider, or email us at podcast@11fs.com. Thank you all so much, and goodbye.